First, you have to understand a little bit about the history of treatment. The history of mental illnesses. We know from reading early Greek and Roman literature that all of the illnesses today were cataloged back then. But of course, except in biblical times, when we know about the healing power of Jesus, there basically just weren't any treatments. And so, the only treatments that were available were banishment, imprisonment, or death. And that pretty much was the case until basically the 1800s. And then we developed largely inhumane hospitals for basically the incarceration of people. Starting in the early 1900s, a new treatment ethic emerged, and that was that by putting people or subjecting people to the extensive examination of their past, their childhood, their relationship to their mothers, their sex life, all those things that came out of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, that some way we could influence the mentally ill. Well, there was some benefit to that, certainly for some people. But by the 80s, it was clear that there was no scientific proof that the Freudian approach really worked for most mental illnesses. Now, all this started changing in 1989 because President George Bush the Elder, partly I'm sure because of Barbara's problems in the past, declared the 90s the decade of the brain. And what we got was immense new funding for the National Institute of Mental Health, which was hitherto a relatively unknown organization. And what has resulted from that has been just breathtaking advances. We have, as I mentioned, all sorts of chemical ways and electrical ways and now imaging techniques where we can definitely tell how the sick brain differs from the well brain. And we can try things and actually see or measure how things are changed. And now we have isolated the genes for schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and clinical depression. So this gives hope for diagnosis and treatment of things that even 5 years ago we couldn't have even have thought about. So how do we treat people? Well, in your handout that I gave you, there's mentioned a book by Rosalind Carter, who's been active in the mental illness area for years. It basically suggests that treatment should be by way of a three-legged stool. And the first approach that's used in most cases, not all cases, but most cases today, is some kind of medication. Now I want you to think about this. 95% of all medications that have been created to treat mental illness have been created in the last 10 years. It seems like there isn't a week that goes by without some medication coming on the market that can have some impact on someone. I wish they'd come up with something that helped my golf game. Okay, now the second area, the second leg of the three-legged stool is talk therapy. Now I said some belittling things about talk therapy a while ago, but today it's different. Today the emphasis in talk therapy is on the present behavior and future behavior. Now I'm not saying that your past can't be important, but this is where the emphasis is today. And the really amazing thing is that they now know that by just changing how a person thinks about something can change one's brain chemicals. They can actually measure it, they can actually see it. So we know that the combination of both medicine and talk therapy can be very powerful and helpful to those with a mental illness. Okay, now the third leg of the three-legged stool is a good support system. Now, this may not sound like it would be so significant, but believe me, for someone struggling with an illness, it can be. This can come from a family member, a friend, or frequently these days it comes from an organized support group. Now, the Mental Health Association, whose number is in my handout, is an excellent organization in this town, and they maintain a list of support groups and helpful suggestions for just about anything that you might want to come up with. Now, I thought support groups, quite frankly, when it was suggested that I go to one, were a pretty wimpy idea. But I gradually realized the importance of them, and I saw how much they helped others. And I eventually got trained to become a facilitator myself and started a group at Chapelwood. And there's such a demand out there that we now have 6 facilitators, and we meet in 4 different rooms. So that shows you that there's something out there that is really needed in this area. So in brief, what I'd say about the treatments today, comparing the treatment of mental illness today versus 15 years ago is like comparing golf lessons of 15 years ago to the golf lessons today after the introduction of the video camera. Now, some of you will understand that. You tennis players won't understand that. So what do I tell people who are struggling with a mental illness problem? Well, first, hold on to hope. If you haven't found the solution yet, it's either out there already or it's coming. Okay, what should you do if you suspect that you or someone close to you has a mental health problem? Well, first, get educated in the area. The Rosalind Carter book is an excellent beginning point. Barnes & Noble is full of books in their pop psychology section. And second, recognize that you may be dealing with a medical problem. The objective then is to get in front of some kind of professional who might be able to diagnose it and help. Now that sounds simple, but it isn't. And why isn't it? Because of the stigma attached to mental illness. If you had a heart problem, or if you had a pain in your gut, or something wrong with your knee, certainly something wrong with your knee that might affect your golf swing, you'd go to a doctor. But if you have something that might affect your brain, even though it's the most complex thing in your body and affects everything in your body, you'd be very resistant to going to get help out of pride, guilt, ignorance, all those things that enter into stigma. Now, this is the same thing that occurred with cancer when we were younger, when there basically were very few or no treatments. You know, if someone had cancer in your family, you didn't talk about it. It's because there was just the absence of treatment. There was a sense of shame. There was a sense of guilt. Well, today, if you have cancer, everybody knows everything about it. So keep in mind that today we have treatments. Do what you can to eliminate the stigma. As people like Barbara Bush and Mike Wallace and William Styron and Philip and the many people who've spoken out about their illnesses do, we'll get rid of the stigma, and people who should be getting treatment will get it, and people will stick to the treatment that go off treatment because they feel stigmatized by the fact they're getting it. Now, if you have a problem, if you think a loved one of yours has some kind of a problem, what should you do? Well, first, after you become educated, I'd suggest part of that education process ought to be going to a therapist yourself to try to learn more about how you might approach that person. But try to get them to talk. Try to get them to open up. Question them about what they're feeling and what's going on with them. They may lash out, they may clam up, they may act like they don't want to talk to you, but that might spur them on to open up to someone else. Because believe me, no one wants to live with inner torment. Don't ignore a problem, because it might end up with someone wrestling with green monsters, or even worse. Okay, well, if I don't leave you with anything else this morning, I'd like to leave you with just two things. Help erase the stigma of mental illness. It's just another illness. It just happens to affect the brain, and it's treatable. People are not getting the treatment that they need because of the stigma of mental illness. And if you or a loved one are struggling in any way with a mental illness, and you haven't found success yet, hold on to hope. If you haven't found that solution, it's either out there or it's on its way. Well, my bucket of range balls is about out. I bet yours is too. I hope the truth about me hasn't been too uncomfortable for you. Frankly, this hasn't been easy, kind of like my golf game lately. But I hope you see why I'm no longer ashamed or feel guilty or secretive about my illness. It's just another illness, and it happens to affect my brain. As you can tell, as John said, I'm pretty passionate about this subject, and I now spend about a third of my working time, that's non-golfing time, trying to help others get a mulligan on life, just as I did. Because, like most of us in our age group, I've found that the greatest joy that I get in life is in helping others in a deeply personal way. Thank you for listening. Think about it this way. If you were a diabetic, and the doctor said you have to take insulin the rest of your life, you'd do it. You wouldn't think about it. But with a mental illness, if a doctor says you need to take this the rest of your life, more than 50% of the people won't do it. Why? The medicine gets them feeling better. And after a while, they talk themselves out of taking it because they feel so good. And then 3 months later, they're back in the toilet again and they're worse. You know, the Oakland Raiders center, all this publicity about him, you know, he stopped taking his medication. You know, that's my answer. You know, untreated bipolar disorder, you know, they frequently end up with all sorts of those psychotic sort of features. So, and the longer you go without treating any of these illnesses, the more it tends to carve the brain and the more difficult they are to treat. So,
what did Jim see in you
well, that's hard for me to say, but I'm sure probably I look like I look this morning. Well, they think it's genetic, largely genetic. They think that the tendency is genetic in most all mental illnesses. You've got the tendency. Now, the extent to which environment comes in there, who knows? But someplace back there in my line, there's undoubtedly someone who had it. But interestingly, in my case, I mean, I have 4 brothers, no sign of mental illness, 2 very stable parents. But you know, someplace back, no suicides that we know of. Generally, when you look at either depressives or bipolars, you look back and you see suicide, alcoholism, this sort of thing back in the lines. But as far as I know, I don't have any. There, you know, schizophrenia, for instance, generally doesn't occur until the late teens, early 20s. Bipolar disorder, it isn't unusual. There's an article, a Time magazine article that I cite in there, that bipolar disorder was generally an illness that occurred in the late 20s, early 30s when I started first having symptoms of it. But now they're saying that it's skipped down. They don't have any idea why, but it's skipped down to young kids. I mean, even less than teenagers. There are tendencies for these illnesses to come at certain times. And if you happen to have drawn a bad gene pool in terms of both parents having a mental illness, the chances of you having something serious and having it earlier are definitely greater. But everyone's different. I mean, that's why treatment is so individual. Big problem. You know, George Bush, George W. has now come out for parity. This has been a problem. The insurance companies are resisting the idea of parity of physical, so-called physical versus mental. I mean, tell me why the brain isn't physical. But in any case, that's a big problem. And you know, there are extensive studies of companies that have given parity, and they've reduced their overall health costs because people who are treated for mental illnesses end up with fewer, quote, physical illnesses. Big problem. Philip Bergera has been instrumental in Houston in getting several companies, including the Texans, to give parity of treatment. The question was what's going to happen in the state of Texas with mental health, with the budget crisis. And I can tell you right now, just from observing people in our groups, I mean, people are, you know, we have so many people who, because of their illness, have been forced to the very bottom of the ladder, and I'm talking about people who are really capable people. And they're, you know, totally out of money, and they depend upon the public health system for their drugs. And you know, if they can't get their illnesses, I mean their drugs, I mean, we're talking about people who are going to be homeless and much more expensive to maintain in our system. They're going to be in the jails. There's going to be lots of problems. Yeah, I might add that's part of facilitator training. We learn how to deal with the very